Mushmi here and Piyush and Himanshu from various companies that have been making great contributions to the Cloud Security Alliance Silicon Valley chapter efforts. And I'll Michael introduce our guest speakers today and the topic, and from there we'll take it.
All right. Well, let's start with our speakers. Alfred Alvarado from McAfee, an operational intelligence analyst working on threat intelligence and analysis of ransomware, among many other attack vectors. Alfred, would you like to add any more by way of introduction?
No, that about says it all. I'm just happy to be here and ready to share some information.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us. Peter Stockburger, a partner at Dentons law firm, the largest law firm in the world, is also with us. Peter, would you like to add any more?
No, thanks, Mike. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm a partner here in San Diego, California, in our privacy and cybersecurity group. So deal with a lot of ransomware questions and ransomware issues with clients. So excited to offer the token lawyer's take after Alfred offers the tech insight. I'll give you my lawyer's 2 cents.
All right. Well, both the technology and the business and legal focus are going to be very, very valuable. I'm excited to hear both. And thank you very much, Peter, as well, for joining us. So by way of introduction to the topic, I mean, ransomware is pervasive throughout the news, both domestically and globally. It's a rising problem. You hear or read different perspectives about the problem. Right, everything from, it's not as bad as the news says to, it's terrible. It's an epidemic. You hear that it targets small businesses disproportionately, or maybe they're just impacted disproportionately. But you also hear that there are, well-crafted, well-resourced, targeted campaigns against, large organizations that can pay large ransoms, like the Colonial Pipeline incident, for example. Taking a few pieces of data from the news and various threat reports. This year's DBIR report from Verizon, where they examined over 39,000 incidents, essentially identified that about 5% of those incidents, about 3,500-ish, were due to ransomware, but only 10% of all the ransomware incidents had some loss, according to the Verizon data set. That loss being generally between $70 and 1.2 million, which is a pretty wide range, but the median being about 11K. I've read that from CrowdStrike's threat report that there are 104 healthcare organizations compromised by what they call, big game hunting ransomware. Those are specific, strains and or campaigns that are targeted on organizations that are likely to be able to pay more. NIST is involved this month. They published not involved in ransomware, but involved in the news. They have published a framework for ransomware risk management, a draft of that framework. You hear about legislation, should we, shouldn't we, laws, regulations, yes, no, good, bad, here in the United States, as well as, in other countries. So with that introduction to ransomware as a topic, let's go ahead and ask our speakers, who are both going to be able to offer, much more thoughtful commentary than I am on, the various, nuances of what's really going on. Jem, do you want to start? Jem, are you maybe muted?
Sorry, the mute is kind of slow with Microsoft Teams. Cool. So thanks again for joining in. And we want to kick off this conversation as what is really ransomware and what has been fueling its massive rise?
Alfred, do you want to go first?
I can take that one. Yeah, for sure. So as many of you are familiar with, ransomware is it's the type of malware that is used to encrypt and eventually steal data from machines and create a unusable system or network. It is being fueled typically by monetary gain. You have since the pandemic, you have widespread remote work. Vulnerabilities that are of public facing applications. And with the pandemic, a lot of the phishing attempts have been geared at COVID-19. So that social engineering aspect takes a fear and allows an attacker to say entice a user to click on a link or download something they shouldn't, and from that point on the ransomware is then either downloaded directly from that link or other malware is installed to gather more information, do a little reconnaissance.
Thank you, Peter. Anything that you would like to add?
Yeah, I would add from a legal standpoint, where we're seeing a rise in ransomware attacks is really around the issue of payment. And it's something that's really gained a lot of attention in the news as to whether an organization should pay the ransom. What's the legal requirement? What's the business need? And from a legal requirement standpoint, we've seen OFAC, which is the federal agency that governs when you can't pay people who are on the sanctions list. They've issued guidance to say, do not issue a payment to someone who is on the sanctions list, or you're going to face scrutiny or penalties from the Treasury Department. You also have the White House and the FBI now publicly saying, don't pay the ransom. But on the counterpoint to that, you have cyber insurance policies that pay the ransom. And you also have a business need sometimes to pay the ransom. So what you see, I think you see a proliferation of ransomware attacks right now because you are seeing high profile ransom payments being paid. And so there's an incentive for a lot of these organizations to strike while the iron's hot in this absence of a regulatory environment or in the absence of a legal environment that can give safe harbor to companies who are maybe hit with ransomware. So it's this perfect storm right now for companies where the legal world is telling you don't pay, but when you're hit with a ransomware attack and your critical business data is frozen and you're losing millions upon millions a day in revenue, that's a real difficult position to be in. And I think we heard the CEO of Colonial Pipeline testify at Congress. He said that was the hardest decision he's ever had to make as a CEO, is paying that ransom. And I believe it, because I bet I can guarantee you he was hearing a legal strategy saying, don't do it, and a business strategy saying, if you don't do it, we're going to lose XYZ money. So, it's a real challenge. And I think that's, in addition to what Alfred mentioned about all these new avenues for vulnerabilities, new avenues for adversaries to get in the system, cloud misconfiguration, people clicking on the wrong links, employee training, remote training. You've got this legal and insurance world that is also creating incentives into the system.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
You touched upon some of the ways that adversaries get access. Let's talk about a specific maybe subset, or maybe not a subset, but this concept of ransomware as a service. Is this anything different than just plain old ransomware? And if so, what is it? Alfred, once again, back to you.
Yeah, so ransomware as a service is kind of a new development. Not new as in, just developed yesterday, but, it's kind of a newer model of business that the adversaries are taking. And what is interesting about it is, the developers of any specific ransomware, let's just say DarkSide, they offer their ransomware as a service, and they can, go out and recruit affiliates to go ahead and, just use their software, their malware, and attack other organizations. And while they're allowing others to use their malware, they're actually taking a cut off of the top as well. So they're making money. They're recruiting affiliates to do all the work, and they're trying to basically, make a gain without having to take the risk. And so ransomware as a service has become, a popular, avenue for criminals to share their malware, and make extra gain from it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Michael, where the ransomware as a service issue is really coming up on the legal side, where we're seeing it a lot, is on the issue of attribution and accountability.
Mm-hmm.
So back in 2017 with the WannaCry and NotPetya attacks, we saw fairly quick attribution by the US government and others like Microsoft to public state actors, tying it directly, for example, to North Korea, Russia, whoever it may be. Even in some cases, we saw with the Iranian attacks on the dam in upstate New York, we saw very quick attribution by the FBI. You're seeing less rapid attribution at the federal level from an agency level, in part because I think the exact issue that Alfred just raised, which is the dark sides of the world are farming out the work. And so now you have a web of players that are 3 to 4 steps removed from the state actor, or even from the intelligence service or the quasi-state actor. And that's impacting ultimate attribution, which is impacting, can you actually go after IP addresses, the issue of going after the ransomware that was just getting paid. And another issue that comes up with attribution, it falls around the issue of force majeure in contracts. So this is to get a little legal on everybody, but I think it's one of the more interesting legal issues right now with ransomware, and that is around.
Bring it.
Yeah. So back in 2017, following the WannaCry NotPetya attacks, there were a lot of submissions under the cyber insurance policies for coverage. And Zurich Insurance, for example, made the argument, they said, well, because the US government attributed the attack to the North Korean state, that is an act of government / act of war, and therefore under the force majeure provision, we don't pay out. And it went all the way to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal, and the Court of Appeal agreed with Zurich. And so, what's important now, I think, is if you're an organization and you think you are potentially going to be holding the bag in a ransomware attack, that you're the vulnerable entity, you need to pay attention to that force majeure language, both in your vendor contracts and in your insurance policy, because changing the language slightly there can mean the difference between not recovering millions of dollars and getting recovery, both indemnification and insurance. So, but to get there, if there's public attribution, then that force majeure provision becomes an issue, and so it's a difficult issue to navigate. But my advice is, I'll just give you an example. Let's say you're a big player. Let's say you're a big hospital system. I think Alfred, you were mentioning, or Michael, I think you mentioned the big game hunting, right? Mm-hmm. That they're going after. Let's say you're a big hospital system and you use a smaller vendor to process your electronic health records. So all your sensitive data is sitting with this vendor. And you know that vendor may be more vulnerable than you are, because as the hospital system, you've got robust security, you got a security team, but your vendor is kind of sitting out there like a sitting duck. They're connected to you, they're holding a lot of your data, and you're not confident they've got the right security. They get hit with ransomware. So you look at your provision, in your force majeure provision as the hospital, what you want in there, you want it to say acts of government, acts of war, not including cyber attacks such as ransomware, even if attributed to a state actor. Because you don't want that vendor to then rely on the FBI's attribution to North Korea to have an excuse to not pay you for the data that they lost as a result of, let's say, a security flaw. On the flip side, if you're going to be one holding the bag, you want to make sure that type of attack is included in your force majeure provision. So, absolutely. Yeah, so I've been negotiating those provisions a lot lately. The second I bring it up, everybody raises a question mark and they say, what are you talking about, act of war? And then I explain it and they're like, oh yeah, we don't want that to happen. So
That's
it's
good.
it's this hot button legal issue that I think often gets overlooked in the whole ransomware debate.
That's a
That
great
makes
point,
sense.
Peter. I think Vishwas was also pointing to attribution of a ransomware data. What happens if you have a ransomware as a service where you cannot attribute? Is there anything that you would like to shed light on?
I mean, from a legal perspective, if there's no attribution, that force majeure provision really can't get triggered without some type of evidence to support your argument that there was an act of government or an act of war. I think the act of war is a little bit of a stretch, in part because the US government has defined war narrowly to not include cyber attacks unless, and this is in the US Army Manual definition of war, and the US has said this publicly with regard to public international law around cyber norms. They have publicly said they've adopted this principle called the Schmidt Principle, where unless the cyber attack results in kinetic damage equivalent to a kinetic attack from missiles, then the cyber attack will not be considered a formal act of war. So I think the act of war provision is probably going to be less relied on than act of government, which if you attribute a cyber attack to a quasi-state actor like the Russian security service, under traditional principles of international attribution, that would be attributed to the state, which would be attributed to the act of government. If you can't attribute, if you have no public attribution, either from a public government or from, let's say, Microsoft, who does this pretty often, or CrowdStrike, then you don't really have much of an argument on the force majeure provision. And it's also difficult for you to hold people accountable if you're going to sue them, for example, under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, or to accuse them of theft or trespass. Without attribution, you're not going to get there. But Alfred, I don't know if you've seen more, I mean, the difficulties with attribution when you're talking about ransomware as a service in this web of players who sort of carve off the top.
As far as I've seen, there has been very little attribution when it comes to ransomware as a service, because what we're doing is we're finding the similarities in the attacks or the events that happen, and from there identifying infrastructure, identifying threat actors, and in order for any, I guess, concrete attribution to be made, there would have to be some either someone to come forward and say, hey, this is who we sold the service to, or there'd have to be some sort of data logging that would allow for that attribution to be made.
I see. So there's an opportunity for attackers to actually hide behind these ransomware as a service proxies and make it even more difficult for attribution.
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
That makes sense.
So if we don't mind, if we could talk a bit more on the technical side, what does a ransomware as a service look like, and from an infrastructure standpoint, and is it always leveraged? Do attackers build their own custom infra, or do they gravitate towards using the service? Does that correlate with the size of the organizations they're attacking? What's your take on this?
So my take on that would be, it's more of a new offering. I think, in the past, when you looked at ransomware, you didn't see too many people willing to share their code.
Mm-hmm.
So, they took the code and made their ransomware, and then they went out and did their attacks, and then they collected on the ransoms. I guess I would, have to venture out and say, because of the attributions that were made quickly in the past, maybe they wanted to distance themselves and set up the infrastructure, set up the servers, set up the threat actors who had access to different organizations. If you look anywhere in the darknet, you're going to see access brokers who are selling access to any type of organization. And with that, they're employing these people to create the avenue for attack, and then they're selling it to other people who either have maybe no knowledge of how to create that ransomware, but they still want to get into the business, And so they're then, providing the infrastructure, they're providing the malware, they're providing just about everything, but little risk to them while they are, while they're sitting there, collecting 35-40% off the top.
Yeah, it seems like it's turned into a whole marketplace of compromised credentials, systems, and other things. There's a question from the audience here. Are ransomware attackers stealing AWS GCP keys and taking those systems hostage, besides, on-premise systems or, more physical infrastructure?
From my experience, I've seen, most of it be in-house infrastructure. I haven't seen very many attacks, that have compromised an AWS server or, any of those cloud services. Misconfigured S3 buckets, definitely there's people out there who are taking advantage of those and getting credentials or getting any information that is stored in there, and collecting that for, nefarious reasons. As the evolution of ransomware continues, I mean, you're seeing new Linux versions, new iOS versions, and you're seeing stuff like that may lead to eventually the more targeted attacks on cloud services.
All right, thank you.
Makes sense. So building on the topic of attribution, who are you each seeing these days as the actor groups? What are the roles, motivations, sort of what's the distribution, as it were?
Well, I'll defer to Alfred on what he's seeing from a technical side, and then I'll offer what I see in the sort of legal realm of what we're dealing with.
All right, Alfred.
Sorry,
I caught him mid drink when I tossed it over to Alfred.
I caught it. I got it right here. So yeah, so if we're looking at attribution to what cyber criminals are responsible for, any type of attack, the community, the cyber community, I guess more or less, I guess the cyber vendors have, all come up with their own names for cyber attacks. Going off of something like a FireEye, you're looking at different APT groups that the advanced persistent threats that are, I guess just, responsible for many of the attacks. But as far as, the technical side of, who's behind it, it really is kind of gray right now because of how ransomware as a service is being deployed.
I would say on the legal side, I mean, obviously DarkSide is heavily in the news, so everybody's heard of them and have heard about what happened with them, and the FBI, taking back several million of the Bitcoin paid by taking control of getting. Nobody knows quite how the FBI got that key to the wallet. They're not being too public about that, but obviously DarkSide, and then Revel. Or Revil, however you want to pronounce it. The Russian group we've seen that a lot with corporate clients. But I agree, a lot of the ransomware is coming out of APT groups, and that's why it's so sophisticated and successful and so difficult to counter and protect against by corporate security groups. I would say, building off what Alfred also mentioned on AWS and the cloud environment, I am seeing a lot of misconfigured AWS buckets in cloud environments where stuff is set to public that's got credentials, or credentials are coded into public facing code. And I saw some survey recently that said over 50% of AWS buckets are misconfigured, which to me is kind of a startling number based on how much AWS has in terms of business. So, if there's a key takeaway for folks on here, is that a real exposure point for you right now legally is having something set to public instead of private, where there's sensitivity relating to the data. Because there are some laws out there that you don't have to prove access or acquisition in order for there to be a breach notification. Public disclosure alone can oftentimes trigger notification requirements, not only under statute, but also under contract. You know, when I negotiate contracts and I am negotiating, let's say on behalf of the bigger organization, and I'm dealing with a vendor, going back to that healthcare and the vendor with softer security, I'm going to put in there a pretty robust breach notification requirement where I want to be notified on disclosure, discovery of accidental or purposeful disclosure. That would include a misconfiguration in a cloud account. So, you know, I would say spend the time and money to scan those cloud accounts, understand where the configuration gaps may be. Because I don't know about you, Alfred, just from the clients that I'm dealing with, and I usually get called when there's a problem. You know, that's why lawyers have such a high drinking rate, because we're always just dealing with problem sets. You know, but I would say on the proactive side, you want to proactively be looking at these cloud accounts, configurations. Don't wait for the problem to occur, because I think that's a real vulnerability area for the ransomware. Even if we're not seeing it yet, I do think that that's going to be a future vector.
I have to add that large cloud vendors have started publishing guidelines as to how to protect your configure your systems. And I think companies and tools have to be developed so that some of this can be automated, because it's repeat and rinse, right? It can't be manual. You might miss something. And do you see, or from a technical perspective, do you see anything like that needed? Because what if it's a actual hack that happened because of a misconfiguration? Do they get reimbursed, or are there legal issues around it because it was an actual error on the part of the vendor? So, I mean,
Yeah.
I see a need for tooling around it to automate some of this stuff.
Yeah, so you've got kind of two issues there. One is if you're storing your own information in the AWS environment, you know, AWS has a shared security model. So they will secure the infrastructure of the cloud. You're responsible for securing your data. And so AWS will publish recommendations, best practices around configuration, but it's on you, the organization, to configure properly, have the appropriate security around access. So there are some, if you're talking about automation in that event, there's a lot of vendors who offer those tools. McAfee may even offer a tool, I don't know, where they will scan your AWS configurations and tell you where some gaps are. You know, I know Palo Alto Networks, for example, also offers a tool called Prisma that does the same function. They'll tell you where the gaps or some vulnerabilities are in the cloud environment. So there are tools out there. I'm not an expert in all the tools, but I would say it's an area where there's a lot of automation right now. On the vendor side, I agree that when you're dealing with a vendor, you have to have some level of audit capability on their security. And I always push for a contractual obligation to allow the party who's providing the data the right to audit their security procedures. And I think that should include audit cloud configurations. Now, not everybody likes that or agrees to it, but those are the types of provisions I think you want to push for, so you can set up some type of automation check. Because you don't want to be sitting in a position like the SolarWinds issue, where your vendors you know, are highly vulnerable and have the SolarWinds vulnerability, and you as the company are left with a vulnerable vendor. So those are some areas that I would pay attention to.
Makes sense. I'm going to double click on one of the things that you both brought up, which was APT groups being, you know, behind much of the development of the ransomware software. So, you know, an APT group is going to be pretty well funded as it is. You know, we already talked about how, at least in the case of Verizon's data set, the median payment is $11K, which is not really going to move the needle for a nation state. So my question to you is the motivation really about disruption, and ransomware is a bit of a smokescreen, right? Or a byproduct, or sort of on the flip side, is the motivation really to get the money because these APT groups are using it from are from countries that are in need of the money, say in like US dollars or something for their trade with their economic partners.
Yeah,
I think if you, oh, go ahead.
go for it, Alfred.
I was gonna say, I think if you look at North Korea, you're looking at someone who's out for monetary gain for sure. You look at some of the actors coming out of Russia. It could be they're trying to fund their operation, but they also could be taking taking cues from higher ups in the government. It's really it's really twofold. I mean, you have the economic side of it, but when someone does want to make a smokescreen, of course, let's throw a little action over here and let's disrupt something, and we'll do something on the other side and get what we're really after. And so it can be used as a smokescreen for sure.
Yeah, Michael, I'm seeing a combination. So I agree with everything Alfred said. We're seeing, at least I see primarily North Korea doing it for a lot of financial motivations. There's some disruptive motivations there as well. With the Sony attack, there was obviously a disruptive motivation there that was publicly attributed to North Korea. The later attacks by North Korea, I think, were more financially driven. WannaCry, NotPetya, I think, were more financially driven than disruptive driven. Iran, I think, is more sabotage driven. We see the Iranian attacks, or at least attempt attacks, focusing on critical infrastructure. I mean, the attack on the dam in upstate New York in particular was an attack that's really focused on physical damage. China, I think there's a lot of intelligence-driven and corporate espionage-driven interests out of the Chinese groups. So sensitive academic databases, medical research, we're seeing from a Chinese perspective. And then I agree from the Russian groups, disruption is a big motivator. There's also some intelligence gathering motivations. Interestingly, and this was DarkSide's position, is they're really trying to distance themselves from the Russian government, in part because the latest DarkSide attack on the Colonial Pipeline really got the attention of the State Department, Defense Department, who made some pretty clear overtures to the Russian state that they're creeping up on crossing a red line from a critical infrastructure standpoint. And I attended a conference, a NATO cybersecurity conference 2 years ago, where they had the Paul Nakasami, who's the head of the NSA, the cyber group, and a representative from the Russian government both speak. And they both said the same thing, which was, we both know that the other side has computers, devices, software planted in the other country, that we've got basically a kill switch on each other. And so there's a mutually assured destruction right now between Russia, especially in the US, from a cyber standpoint. So I think you're seeing more, I think, distancing from the Russian state, from the APT groups, because of this heightened political threat. But I think it's a mixed bag, Michael, to get back to your original question on motivations.
Interesting. So let's say you're fortunate enough as an organization that you have not yet had a ransomware event, and you're in a position to do some proactive steps, be prepared, and kind of, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. From both a legal focus and a technical focus, right? What are your recommendations to these organizations that can get in front of it?
And sorry, just to inject one thing, and maybe the flip side is, what if you don't take any precautions? Do you have any liability there?
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense, right? As opposed to what can you do, what must you do? What are you expected to be doing?
I think one of the expectations is for sure, keep an eye on your, security patches, keeping an eye on your, password usage, using multi-factor authentication, putting the precautions in place that will help you to mitigate those, those attack attempts. But, further than that, I mean, you have to, plan for things such as, if we do get attacked, what is our response? What do we do? Do we have a playbook? Do we have something that is written down? Okay, this is the steps that we take. We notice an attack. We engage, C levels, and we engage, the law enforcement. These steps are taken, and then when do we publicly make any notifications that something has gone wrong? Having that playbook and having something that you can test time and time again and record your findings will help, I think, get many organizations in front of what happens when the attack does occur. And so I think there has to be like I said, all the technical stuff with patching and password usage, but you also have to have a plan in place.
Yeah, I would, building on what Alfred said, everything that Alfred just mentioned, I think goes to putting in controls that are recognized under a variety of different cybersecurity frameworks. And so when you bring it back to what is your liability, what's your risk, it comes down to, are you maintaining reasonable security around the sensitive data that you hold? Because your legal risk is around folks' personal information. That's where the legal risk comes in. You obviously have reputational risk if your sensitive financial information is stolen. You obviously have potential contractual risk if your information on a partner or business partner is stolen, confidential information, patent information. But when you're talking about the big legal risk, you're talking about what are you doing around people's personal information? And each of the laws that address this, the California Consumer Privacy Act, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, HIPAA, the state breach notification rules, they all use the same phrasing, which is you must maintain reasonable security appropriate to the sensitivity of the data you hold. And so what you have to do on a proactive level is you have to measure yourself against what's deemed reasonable in the jurisdictions in which you operate and where the data is subject to. So for example, in California, in 2016, then Attorney General Kamala Harris issued a report where she said that baseline reasonable security in California is alignment with the CIS controls. And so the Center for Internet Security Controls, I'm sure everybody's familiar with it. It matches to NIST largely. So as a baseline measure in California, you have to measure yourself against that control framework. Well, everything Alfred just mentioned is in that framework. Do you have adequate access controls? Do you have adequate threat identification, vulnerability management, risk management? Are you actively looking at your vulnerabilities, managing your software development? Those are all built into the CIS controls. The other important, so I think on a proactive level, to maintain your legal and regulatory compliance, you need to be regularly measuring your program against those controls. Do we have the right policies in place? Do we have gaps? How can we remediate those? But then the other part of the CIS control framework that Alfred mentioned is the incident response planning. So proactively preventing and doing the blocking and tackling. But if you get hit, what do you do in the incident? And this incident response planning has a number of components that you need to think about in order to protect yourself. One is the document itself. Do you have an incident response plan? And do you have one that people will actually read and is useful? The example that I always find useful is McDonald's has inside their kitchens, they have these giant binders that says fire, shooting, customer violence, and there are these.
A little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, I mean, but you pull it off, and it is so rudimentary, step by step, what you're supposed to do. That's really what an incident response plan should be. It should be a step-by-step playbook, user-friendly, not filled with lingo and referencing other policies that you can pull off the shelf and you can address the incident. I think for ransomware in particular, your incident response plan should be addressing some key components. And one is not whether you're going to pay the ransom. I don't think that should be in your written policy, but who are the decision makers for that decision? Where does the buck stop? Who's making that ultimate call? What do you do when your computers and your telephones are offline and you can't communicate with customers? What's the backup communication channel? Who's responsible for standing that up? So that written plan is really an important part. I help clients all the time in writing those, getting those condensed down. It's a workshop process. You got to figure out what works and what doesn't. It's not a template-driven document by any means. And then you have to test it. And I think that it's kind of like my favorite episode of Seinfeld is when he makes the car reservation and he goes to get the car and she's like, well, I took the reservation. He's like, anyone can just take the reservation. It's the holding of the reservation. And and here it's the testing of the incident response plan. So tabletop exercises, running those exercises, getting the C-suite in the room and going through a ransomware event. And you will soon find out who knows their role and who doesn't, and who's upset that you're paying and who's upset that you're not. So I think all of those are important components to an overall security program. And this is really part of how you protect yourself from liability, Michael, which was your last question. Because if you have sensitive data that is compromised in ransomware, and you then notify, let's say 500 people or 1,000 people, hey, your account's been compromised, et cetera. They can sue you for class action liability, for example, under the California Consumer Privacy Act and get $750 per consumer without proving damages. So even with 1,000 people, I'll just do the quick math there, that's $750,000 in damages without proving any injury. Not on top of anything related to identity theft. And so if the standard in California is reasonable security, and you are measuring yourself against the CIS controls at the appropriate tier, and you're testing your incident response plan, and you're identifying vulnerabilities, and you have risk management, and you have the right policies in place, but you still got hit with ransomware, as your lawyer, my argument is going to be they were being reasonable. They just got unlucky. What you don't want to be in a position of is where you've hired Alfred and McAfee to run an assessment of your system. You get a report back that says you've got 40 critical vulnerabilities, and you take 6 months to close those. And in that 6-month period, your data gets locked up. That, if I'm on the other side and I'm the plaintiff's lawyer, that's exhibit A to you not being reasonable. Because now you're not aligning yourself with the control framework. And that's really how the legal arguments go. So you always want to just be stacking yourself up to make that reasonable argument. The more you can make, the more the better. I saw a comment, by the way, in the chat function saying, how is this different, incident response plan, from disaster recovery planning? And, the two are interrelated. If you completely lose all your data or your systems, you've got to have a disaster recovery plan to back that up to come back online. That can be part of your incident response plan, but disaster recovery also applies to non-data security incidents, earthquakes, tornadoes, floods, fire and emergency. So I generally see those as two separate policies, but they're usually interwoven and they should be included in the tabletops.
Makes sense.
I think the question was, at least from my understanding of BCP is, your business continuity plan. What are you going to do to continue business at a, if an incident happens? Your disaster recovery is, what are you going to do when disaster strikes? What are the steps you're going to take? And so, it is just, there's a difference in those two plans because, one is how your business is going to continue and one is how are you going to recover.
Yeah, and in addition, there are going to be subparts to these plans, right? Whatever we call the umbrella topic, incident response, BCP, DR, et cetera, there really needs to be playbooks for different types of scenarios, right? Like a ransomware response sequence of steps is going to be different from, we have a tornado coming in sequence of steps. And so I think these concepts become even more differentiated when you get to that playbook level, right? We have to recover data. We have to fail over data centers. We have to, let every employee work from home, right? These types of things. Just my two.
And one other thing, because of the lawyer on the panel, I wanted to add on the incident response planning, which is the importance of maintaining attorney-client privilege in the midst of an incident, as well as during the proactive side of the work. So when you get sued from a data breach and they want to see a copy of that report that Alfred put together, if you structured that report to be done through me, and it was for the purpose of a legal investigation, well, then we can argue, well, Alfred's report can't be disclosed because it's privileged. Now, oftentimes you may want to develop two reports. Verizon did that in a case involving the Target breach several years ago, where they created two separate reports, one that was producible and one that was privileged. So it really takes a lot of planning in the midst of an incident to involve outside counsel, involve a forensic firm. But you want to do that also on the proactive side. When you are proactively looking at your gaps and vulnerabilities, oftentimes you'll get a report that has red flags, high vulnerability, high criticality. Well, if you can structure that in a way where that report that has those value judgments in it is privileged, but then you have a non-privileged part that just explains work was done, but it doesn't say what was found, then maybe you're protecting yourself, 20 steps down the road if that vulnerability is never closed. So of course, I'm self-interested. I always say get a lawyer involved early. But on that proactive side, minimal steps like having the contract signed through the law firm can be leaps and bounds of protection on that proactive report, even when you're just doing routine security assessments.
Good advice. Thank you. So let's pivot to some advice for those who have gotten impacted or in the future do get impacted by ransomware, right? Maybe these organizations are just the unlucky ones. They did all the diligence. They did the right steps. Maybe they haven't done the right steps, et cetera. But in either case, here they are, right? They're in the middle of an impact. What do you suggest, again, from a technical and legal perspective, by way of response and reactive steps?
So are we talking, I just got, infected right now. What steps should I take? Is that me,
I mean, I'm thinking a scenario of my organization's just been impacted, right? Someone's called me, told me, or I've otherwise detected I can't access my data, right? So not quite as early as I've detected something but not been impacted, right? But let's say there's actually an impact at this point.
Right. So, in that particular scenario, I mean, you got to, at least in my experience, it'd be, you've got to isolate the machine. Okay, get that machine off the network, and from there work on maybe creating an image of the machine. So when law enforcement gets involved or your own incident response team gets involved, they can take a look at the image and be able to determine what kind of infection you have. Is it, if it is ransomware indeed, what can they do to figure out where it came from? You have to pull your logs, pull your machine off the network, and just try to mitigate the spread of the virus at that point.
Yeah, and I would say on top of that sort of immediate triage, stopping the bleeding action, from an organizational standpoint, one of the first things you want to do is obviously trigger your incident response plan or follow the trigger. But immediately, I would say you want to get the sort of core decision makers together on a call, not an email. Include your outside counsel and come up with a game plan on who's going to quarterback the organization of the response. Because I think it's really critical in those early stages to limit the universe of people who are involved on the decision making, limit the universe of people who have knowledge of what's happening, and control communication, both internally and externally to your customers. And so I think you need to have a control group whether that's led by your CISO or your counsel or general counsel or CEO, whatever the case may be, that I think that's very important. Part of that coming out of that group is I think it's also important to you to review your insurance policy quickly to see if there's some type of notification trigger, as well as any contractual impacts, because contracts will often have a very quick notification turnaround, separate from if you have any statutory notice down the road. So those are things I think the legal department should be running, but those are kind of a lot of stuff that has to be looked at in the midst of the technical redress that Alfred's talking about. And I saw a comment that just popped up in the conversation, which is well taken, and that is have a physical copy of your incident response plan available so that does not get locked, which just happened to a client of mine where their incident response plan was locked. So great advice there.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we're nearing the end of our time. So there's a lot of obvious topics we could continue with, but let's be respectful of everybody's time, and maybe just offer both you, Alfred, and Peter, the opportunity for closing comments. If there's anything else you kind of want to share, be it what to do, your thoughts on the legal happenings. Should we or shouldn't we introduce legislation? Any advice, closing thoughts, or feedback? Alfred, let's start with you.
Sure. So, as far as the technical side of it goes, I mean, putting mitigations in place definitely is kind of your starting point. You got to, one, know what's on your network, know what machines, what software, and go from there and start building your security plan out. And what I'm referring to is the 20 critical security controls from SANS. Kind of follow that list and try to, reach or attain those. And it does take quite a while to kind of get that out there. But if there's technical help that needs to be had, and I'm going to plug McAfee here real quick. McAfee has an insights platform, which we actually gather a lot of this intelligence, a lot of this information from artifacts that are left by adversaries when they do have these attacks, and they're really helpful to have when you want to go through and look at your SIM and kind of do a little bit of hunting for information that may lead to you saying, hey, there has been an attack on our network. As far as go ahead.
Go ahead, Alfred.
No, I was just going to say, as far as closing, I mean, there's definitely lots of information that is out there. There's a lot of information that we can go over, as you have said. But if there's ever a need, the community is pretty good about sharing and about helping each other out.
Yeah, I would say my 2 cents are: review your contracts now, review your vendor contracts, review your insurance policy. Look at your vulnerability gaps. Have you run a tabletop? Have you dusted off that incident response plan? That's stuff you can do now, immediate. You don't have to wait for an attack to happen to do it. It'll give you peace of mind and help protect yourself legally. The second piece of advice I would have is around data minimization. Look at your data retention policies. How much data are you holding and keeping that you don't need? If you can start offloading data and getting rid of sensitive data that you've got sitting around, you minimize your exposure, you minimize the attractiveness of your organization to ransomware groups. So that data retention policy that sits there that nobody reads, and that data minimization project that everybody has on their table, my advice is pick it up and run with it, and that will help you objectively kind of reduce your exposure profile. And of course, as McAfee's ready, Dentons is also ready to help you with any of those policy reviews, and happy to chat further offline if anyone has questions.
Thank you both. And with that, we'll close things out. Members of the chapter, we're always reaching out to you and looking for your feedback. If you want to cover any further topics with regard to ransomware or any other security matter, please share that with us, because we can have follow-up discussions as one of our upcoming meetups or in-person meetings when we get back to in-person meetings. Thank you very much, Alfred and Peter, for joining us. Thank you, everyone, members of the chapter, members of the board, for joining us as well. Everybody have a great rest of your day, and be well.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.